lovely to be on the Isle of Wight, where I haven't been for a very long time. And it's also obviously very exciting for a writer to be in a room with more than one person. We do lead rather sad lives. And also, you never know when you go to do a talk how many people are going to be there. And, you know, I always think if there are 3 or more, it's okay. And if there's less than 3, it's kind of more like therapy. I heard a story of an English literary novelist who was promoting his latest novel in Europe, and he had a great big itinerary done by the British Council and all these places he was going to do readings. And he got to one in Finland, a huge 300-seater auditorium, and there's one man sitting in the back row. So he did what we do in these circumstances, and he waited till 10 minutes after the thing was meant to start. And then he went up to the guy at the back and he said, "Look, if you want to talk about my books, why don't we just go and have a drink?" And the man said, "You read." So down he went to the podium and he said, "I'd like to read from my latest novel. This is where the 2 young lovers meet for the first time." And he read his prepared 10-minute reading. No reaction, nothing. So he went up to the back of the auditorium and he said to the guy, "Look, tell you what, we're going to have a drink. I'll pay for the drinks. I'll give you 2 signed copies of the book. How about that?" And the man said, "You read." And he said, "Well, why are you so insistent that I should read?" And he said, "Because I have been booked to play the piano during the interval." And I have a horrible feeling that's true. There's something so painful about it that it has to be true. I'm very lucky to have made a living, more or less, from something that I would do anyway. I can't really remember a time that I didn't want to write or wasn't trying to write. I still am trying to write, actually. But a lot of writers say that somewhere in their background there is a charismatic English teacher. And at my boys' prep school, I did have Mr. Evans, he was called. Teachers didn't have first names in those days. And he used to set this class of 7-year-old boys. We had a list of words each week, and we had to learn how to spell them and also how to define them, which was fine. But I remember one of my classmates, we had the word impeccable. And he spelt it perfectly, but his definition was impervious to other birds. And when my youngest child, Jack, first had homework at his prep school, first week, he had homework where he was given a list of words, and he had to learn not how to spell them, but also use them in a sentence. And after we got this very grumpy little boy to bed, my wife and I went down and sort of opened his school bag to see he'd done his homework all right. And I must say, educational standards had slipped considerably. It wasn't impeccable. That first week he had the word "what," which he had spelt perfectly, W-H-A-T, but the sentence in which he had used it was "jolly good show, what?" Which very misleading, I think, of the kind of upbringing we'd given him. Anyway, the other thing that Mr. Evans did, I remember he set this class of 7-year-old boys the very inventive or rather morbid task of writing our own epitaph. And I wrote this epitaph, I remember, and it went, "Here I lie," slightly difficult death to engineer, I think, but "Here I lie, S. Brett by name, killed by a lion I thought was tame." And from that time, everything I'd written ended up with jokes in it. And it was something I'd tried to curb over the years every now and then. And after I'd written about 10 of my Charles Paris sort of humorous crime novels, I thought I'd write a serious psychological thriller with no jokes in it. And so I wrote a book called A Shock to the System. And I thought there were no jokes. But when it was published, all the reviews talked about black humor, wicked, satirical take on life. And so I was kind of stuck for it. It was a very important book in my life because it's the only one of my books that was made into a feature film starring Michael Caine. Not a lot of people know that. Not a lot of people went to see it either. But my only involvement in the process, it was all made in the States. And my involvement was bending down to the doormat and picking up an envelope which contained the largest cheque of my professional life. Wish it happened more often. But in fact, my wife and I built onto our kitchen a conservatory. which we still call the Michael Caine Annex. He doesn't know that. Anyway, we happened to be in New York when the movie opened, and you hear about movies being launched, and this one more sort of slipped off its moorings while nobody was watching. But by then we'd met the screenwriter, a lovely guy called Drew Claven, and he had had a miserable time on the movie because, as you may know, writers are not respected in Hollywood. It's the only place you can be introduced as the current writer on a project, which is pretty dispiriting. And in Hollywood, they tell the story of the starlet who was so dumb she slept with the writer. Oh, God. Anyway, as I say, we'd met Drew, and he's still a good mate, actually. And he had found out when they were doing the crew showing of the movie, and that's just before it opens to the public in a cinema, and all the people who worked on it are there with their mates. And it's very sweet because all those endless credits, you know, the best boy and the gaffer and the second unit director and the hairdresser's hairdresser, they're all there with their mates, and they get little rounds of applause when their credits came up. Very sweet. Anyway, before the movie opened, I was sitting there with my wife beside me, and I was rigid with fear because I didn't know what they'd done to my book. And Drew Claven was sitting there with his wife beside him, and he was rigid with fear because he did know what they'd done to his screenplay. And my wife leant across and stroked my arm and said, "It's a very nice conservatory." Which I think is probably why we're still married, actually. Anyway, you write one epitaph at the age of 7. This is no basis for a full-time career as a writer, and I did go through the normal educational processes. And at my school, we used to do this thing where you take one A-level at the end of your first year sixth, and then 3 A-levels at the end of the second year sixth. And if you were going to apply for Oxford and Cambridge, you'd do that in the November at the beginning of the second year. So I got my 1 A-level, and then I was lucky enough to get a scholarship to Oxford. And I thought, do I have to stay at school? And so I left school before taking the other A-levels and taught in a primary school for a term, which I'm sure was much more useful. Anyway, this kind of came to haunt me because I was at Oxford in the late 1960s when men's colleges were open to women. I think it was every alternate Tuesday between 4 and 4:30 or something. And you literally had to climb back in if you were out after 11 o'clock. And I had a great excitement. I had a friend who had a girlfriend from home. In itself, very exciting. And then even more exciting, the girlfriend, Christine, was going to come and stay in Oxford for a weekend. Oh. And the question was, where would she stay? And I said, oh, well, I've got a bedroom and a sitting room. She can stay in my sitting room, you see. I'm not sure what Jim, my friend, was planning. Anyway, and in fact, come the night that she stayed, I gave up the bedroom. She slept there, and I slept in my sitting room, you see. Totally innocent, so innocent that I wrote to my mother and told her what had happened. And I had this furious, fulminating letter back from my mother saying, "Simon, don't ever again have a woman staying in your room while you're at Oxford. Remember, you've only got 1 A-level." I actually, I got very involved in doing theatre and stuff when I was at Oxford, and I got involved in writing and performing in the late night revues, which went to the Edinburgh Festival. And the second year, which I think was 1967, quite a long time ago, I directed and wrote a lot of the revue, and it happened at the Edinburgh Festival, and some people from the BBC came to see it and seemed vaguely interested in something with my career, I didn't know what. But anyway, I went home to my parents early September, and they were very good about it. You know, I'd finished my degree, and it was well into October before they said, "Had you thought about getting a job at all at any level?" And it wasn't a joke. There were jobs for graduates and even some for grown-ups. And I said, well, I've got feelers out at the BBC, but I'll tell you what, I'll go to what was then called the Labour Exchange and see if I can get something temporary to tide me over. So I went to the Labour Exchange in Sutton in Surrey, and I was sat opposite a rather daunting lady who said, "Have you got any qualifications?" And I said, well, I've got a first-class honours degree in English from Oxford University. And she said, not much call for that round here. She said, I'll tell you what, the local department store, Shinners of Sutton, are looking for extra staff over the Christmas period. In fact, she said, I think they're looking for a Father Christmas. And I still have at home this little green card which says, this introduces Mr. S.A. Elbrecht for the advertised vacancy of Father Christmas. And I went from the Labour Exchange up Sutton High Street, which no longer exists. They've taken out the centre of Sutton. But anyway, I went up to Shinners of Sutton, the department store, and I went to the toy department, which, as I recall, was on the second floor to the right of the lift opposite Ladies' Fur Trimmed. And I met the buyer and did a couple of exploratory ho-ho-hos. And at the age of just 22, I was master of my own grotto. It does look wonderful on a CV, actually. I've only had 3 jobs in my life. I was a radio producer with the BBC and a television producer with London Weekend Television, but much more interesting, I was Father Christmas in a department store. If any of you are offered this wonderful career opportunity, be a little wary, because for one thing, it was very hot, because the ladies in Ladies' Fur Trimmed ran up this red acrylic number for me, and I got the boots and the big buckled belt and the hat and the wig and the beard. And for the first 3 or 4 weeks, such a Stanislavski an actor was I, that I padded myself to look the part. No longer necessary. The other real hazard was the music. They had a 40-minute tape loop of Christmas songs, I mean, which is fine for the average purchaser because you're in and out in 10 minutes and, you know, you've done your shopping. But if you sit in the same grotto for 7 weeks, it does have a very deleterious effect on the human brain, which is actually still with me. I'm getting a bit worried because Christmas is approaching, and last Christmas I went to a carol concert and the entire congregation was belting out "Hark the Herald Angels Sing," came to a perfect unison close, and one voice, mine, went straight into Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. These things stay with you. It couldn't last. The work was by its nature seasonal. And come Christmas Eve, talk of keeping me on as an Easter bunny came to nothing. And so I was effectively given the sack. And fortunately, my contacts at the BBC had led to my being offered a 1-year contract as a radio producer in the light entertainment department. And I did that year, and I stayed for about 10 years as a radio producer. And I still love radio. It's such a flexible medium and so lovely for a writer. And a lot of the media are very collaborative. You know, you go onto a film set, there are literally hundreds of people around. Television, there could easily be 50 people milling around. Radio, very simple, you know, just a few people in a studio. But you get the feeling, if you're a writer, that every member of the listening audience is helping too, because they're all forming their own images of the characters you create. And I remember once I just started the radio series After Henry with Prunella Scales and Joan Sanderson. And I went to, there was something in the post office where I had to sign a check, and the woman behind the counter saw my name and said, "Oh, I didn't know you knew my mother." And I sort of thought, oh, God, this is some terrible social solecism, you know, I must have met her at a drinks party. And she said, no, my mother is the mother in After Henry, which I was rather pleased about. And in fact, the mother in After Henry was Eleanor. It was played by the wonderful Joan Sanderson, who was always playing these terrible dragons. You know, you remember her as the deaf lady in Fawlty Towers and all that. And she was absolutely the sweetest woman you could imagine off stage. And she actually brought cakes to rehearsals. I mean, you know, in the television world, that is the mark of someone really exceptional, cakes at rehearsals. But she said something to me which I always think of when I think of how close comedy and tragedy are. Because a lot of people, you know, writing comedy, they say, oh, wouldn't it be funny if ABCD happened? And I think more, wouldn't it be funny if it weren't tragic if ABCD happened? And Joan told me this story. She lived in a little village in the Cotswolds. I think it was Shipton under Wychwood. I can't remember. I think it was and they had one of those terrible incidents where an elderly couple, both in their 80s, suddenly one day the husband took a shotgun, killed his wife, turned it on himself, both dead. Terrible tragedy, but in a little village, a lot of gossip. And Joan said she was in the village shop a few weeks after it happened, and she heard the woman in front of her saying to the shopkeeper, "But it's so strange. I mean, they've never done anything like that before." Which stays with me. I really enjoyed my working in radio. Probably in this talk, I'm going to talk about more when I was a producer than being a writer, though I've been a writer much longer. But being a writer is really very boring. I mean, you sit in front of a keyboard and a screen and you write. I met more interesting people, probably, when I was a producer. But I worked with a lot of elderly comedians. I worked with Harry Worth, Ted Ray, Kenneth Williams, Alfred Marks, Roy Hudd, and I think they would ring each other up, you know, and they'd say, "Oh, you got any work?" And they say, "Oh yes, I'm doing a series with Simon Brett." And the other one would say, "Oh, I'm so sorry," because I think it was the final nail in their coffins. But the wonderful thing about, you know, it's a point of honor with a comedian to come in with a new joke. So I can remember some of those from way back. I remember Alfred Marks I was working with, and he once came in and he said, "I won't say my wife's jealous, but she's the only woman I know." And Roy Hudd told me this story about a little boy in a woodwork class, and he's making something, and the teacher comes across and says, "Oh, what are you making?" He said, "Oh, it's a portable." And the teacher says, "A portable what?" And he said, "I don't know, I've only made the handle." And of course, Barry Cryer I also worked a lot with, and he was always reliable for a joke. And the one of his I love is, "Oh, I've been trying to think of the right word for a fortnight. No, I got it completely wrong. Sorry, I killed that." What Barry said was, "I've been trying to think of the right word for 2 weeks." And the answer was fortnight. Oh dear. Go back to joke school. Sorry about that. But I also worked, it's amazing because back then when I was a producer in my early 20s, I worked on Just a Minute. I produced that. And I'm sorry, I haven't a clue. Little thinking that in my 70s they would still be running. It's amazing. I remember got wonderful stories from all those. But I remember Barry Cryer and Willie Rushton used to do a show together called Two Old Farts in the Night, which they toured all over the place. And there was one venue they went to where the theatre manager was, you know, really annoyed them, and he kept being nitpicking about, you know, come in and he'd say, "Oh, the cleaners tell me that, you know, there are lots of beer bottles left round the dressing room last night," and he'd always got some nitpicking argument. And to add to the complication, the theatre manager was actually blind, and he had a guide dog. So they said, you know, every night before the performance started, they would hear the tap, tap, tap of his stick and the dog coming to their dressing room. Then he'd come in and sort of tear them off a strip for what a mess they'd made. And they were getting very sick of this. And one day, when he had stopped for a breath in his tirade, Willie said, "Very cruel of them to give him a cat." And when I was producing Just a Minute, I was with the Nicholas Parsons, of course, was still in the chair, and it was Derek Nimmo, Clement Freud, Peter Jones and Kenneth Williams, who I worked with. And they were always, they didn't really like each other a lot. And to do a good, I mean, the producing wasn't complicated, the editing was the difficult bit, but they all whinged. And so a good production was where you'd listen to a whinge from each of them for about 5 minutes before the show happened, except for Peter Jones, it should be said, who was always delightful. But I remember Clement Freud once saying to me, Simon, I often think this show would be better if the chairman wasn't a congenital idiot. And Nicholas long outlived him. Actually, the other thing, Clement Freud, I was once talking to him, and we were talking about epitaphs, and he said the epitaph he would like on his gravestone was best before, and then the year when he died, which I thought was rather sweet. And Kenneth Williams, I worked with a lot, and he wasn't a relaxing person to be around, but he was wonderfully funny. And, you know, I probably laughed more in his company than anyone else. And he was very odd about fame. I mean, he liked being famous, but it also kind of embarrassed him. And and I remember he came into the studio one day and he was absolutely apoplectic with rage. And I said, well, what's happened, Ken? He said, well, I went into the bank. And these were banks, you know, before we all had cards and ATMs and all that. And I think, you know, to cash a check in another branch, you needed to have an arrangement. Anyway, I said, well, what happened? And he said, well, this chit of a girl behind the counter, this chit of a girl said, yeah, you're that Kenneth Williams, aren't you? And he said, I don't think it's really important. I'm here on business. He said, go on, tell me, you're Kenneth Williams, aren't you? He said, this is not important. I'm here on business. She said, go on, tell me, you are Kenneth Williams, aren't you? And he said, well, very well, all right, I am Kenneth Williams. Now, please, could you cash this check? And she said, oh, no, not without identification. No, it was great fun. I also, I worked on light drama and things. And in fact, I produced the radio adaptations of the Lord Peter Wimsey stories. And Ian Carmichael had just played the part on television, and they wanted to do them on radio. And so I worked with him on those. And that was the thing that made me first think about writing a crime novel, because I was working very closely with the guy who adapted the scripts, called Chris Miller, who's still a good mate. And when we took apart these classics of the genre, you know, crime fiction, we actually found some very encouraging things. I mean, we found holes in Dorothy L. Sayers' plots, which was very encouraging. And we also found that although the plot was important, character and dialogue were at least as important. And I thought to myself, well, I don't know whether I can do plots. And there are still newspaper critics of that opinion. But I think I can do character and dialogue. And so that's when I wrote the first Charles Paris mystery called Cast in Order of Disappearance. And I remember it sort of coincided with my wife being pregnant with our first daughter, and I thought I ought to contribute something creative as well. And I remember about 3 weeks after our daughter Sophie was born, I had a letter from Gollancz, the publishers, saying they were interested in publishing the book. And I thought, my life is going to change, maybe. And of course, Bill Nighy now plays Charles Paris on Radio 4 rather wonderfully, I think. Bill, because Charles Paris, for those who don't know, is an actor who has too much of a taste for young actresses and far too much of a taste for Bell's whiskey. And Bill Nighy hasn't touched a drop of alcohol for over 30 years, but he has a very good memory. And so he plays the part wonderfully. And I was once having a conversation with Bill about unhelpful notes that directors had given to actors. And he said he'd once been cast in a radio play, and he'd been cast with Diana Quick, who was then his partner. They're not together now, but they were then. And it was a whole series where real-life partners are being cast in plays, and so Judi Dench and Michael Williams and various others. And he said there was a sex scene, And I mean, we're talking Radio 4, so either just before or just after sex scene. And it was the view of the director that Bill wasn't putting sufficient vim and vigour into his acting. So the director put down the talkback key and said to the entire audience, or everyone who was in the studio, "Oh, come on, Bill, cast your mind back." So anyway, as I said, it was doing the Dorothy L. Sayers things that got me into writing crime fiction. And I'd always wanted to be a writer, but I didn't think it was a realistic ambition. And if any of you are aspiring novelists, be comforted by the fact that I've wrote 4 very properly unpublished novels before I had one accepted. And on Tuesday this week, no, Monday, I had a end of September deadline on a book, and I delivered my 120th book then. So hang on in there if you, yes, okay. I would, in terms of, the lovely thing about crime writers is that I think they're all very benign. I don't know a crime writer I don't like. Most of us know each other fairly well because we appear on platforms and things together. And I remember, since we'll shortly be opening up to questions, I'll tell you about a conversation I had with P.D. James about the questions that she didn't like being asked. And we agreed that the most difficult questions, which we get quite often, are, 1, where do you get your ideas from? Which, you know, you could talk for 3.5 hours on that, but I mean, it's... and the other was, are you writing anything at the moment? And Phyllis P.D. James told me that she once had a call from her agent saying that a Dutch television company wanted to do an interview with her, and they'd arrive at 8:30 in the morning and do the interview and be away by 10. Okay, so she agreed to do it, and the Dutch television company came to her house, lovely house in Holland Park Road, where she lived, and they came at 8:30 as promised, and because it was a television company, they laid cables all across her nice carpets, they trod mud into the carpets, they moved all her precious artifacts around in her study and this kind of thing, and finally, at just after noon, she was sat down to do the interview. And the interviewer began with the first question, "Miss James, are you writing anything at the moment?" And Phyllis said, "Well, I would be." She was absolutely enchanting, in fact. She was a wonderful woman. I tutored a couple of writing courses with her. I don't know if any of you have heard something called the Arvon Foundation, which is, it does sort of residential courses for learning how to write. And I did a couple with her. And I remember, because if you're doing a writing course, you know, certainly if it's residential, the first session, you go around the room and ask, you know, people why they've come on the course. And for the tutors, you know, your mind is racing because you think, oh God, that one's already written 7 novels. That one, you know, and you're trying to work out how people are, how they're going to react to what you're doing for the next week. And it doesn't always, you know, the answers are not always predictable. I remember once doing a course, and there was a very crusty-looking gentleman in tweed sitting in the corner, and I got round to him and I said, "Well, why have you come on this crime fiction course?" And he said, "Because the Spanish course was full." But from that moment, he was brilliant. He'd never thought about writing at all, but he'd had a really interesting life. You know, he'd been parachuted in behind enemy lines in Norway and that kind of thing. So he was absolutely brilliant because he'd got all these backgrounds. And there is a danger with writers that if they spend too much time, you know, sitting behind a keyboard, they don't see outside. And it's always a bad sign if writers write a book about writers. And even worse, if they write a book about writers with writer's block, that's a very bad sign. And this thing of asking, I remember I was once doing a writing course, again on crime fiction, and there was a charming, mature couple. I mean, they were probably about my age, but I was a lot younger. I'd gone round the room, you know, why do you want to come on this course? What are you hoping to get out of it? And some would say, oh, I've written short stories, but, you know, I want to extend to novel length, or I've written romance, but I'd like to have a go at crime, or this kind of thing. Anyway, we went round, and as we were breaking for coffee, the wife of the elderly couple tapped my knee and, pointing to her husband, said, he was too modest to tell you himself, but he's chairman of the parish council. Which, as you all know, is a great qualification for a novelist. I mean, but I mean, what I like about writing is that, you know, I mean, my radio background meant that I listened to things, you hear things. I mean, that's a wonderful line about the little boy who was asked if he liked radio or television better. And he said, radio because the pictures are better, which I think is a lovely idea. And obviously you listen to when things work and when they don't work. And, you know, I mean, I always read out loud to myself everything I write, whether it's for performance or if it's one of the books, because you just hear strange little echoes of things which are wrong, and also misreadings and things. I remember being told a couple of misreadings from the early days of American commercial radio. I mean, now if we listen to the commercials, they're neatly packaged and recorded, but in those days they would just give the presenter a sheet of paper and he or she would read what was written there. Led to a couple of famous bloopers, one of which was for a well-known American soft drink. And the presenter read what he saw on the page, and he read, yes, remember the name, the Big Seven and UP after, which was not what the makers of 7-Up had in mind. And the other one was a commercial for a well-known make of remedial footwear. And he again read what he saw on the page, and he read, if you think your feet are bad, you should see Dr. Scholl's. So it's a very good reason for reading. And around the BBC, there are all kinds of probably apocryphal ones that go around, like the World Service newsreader starting his first bulletin. And he said, it is 9 o'clock Greenwich. Meantime, here is the news. So I'm a great reader out of things too. And also you get lines from people. I mean, as a writer, you're always listening and you hear little strange things and you think, how has this person got to this point to say that? I remember a few months ago, I was on the seafront at Littlehampton and I saw a woman talking to her dog and she said, are you looking forward to your MRI scan? I mean, where does that come from? And I remember, and it shows how long these things can stay with you. But in 1969, I was driving up to the Edinburgh Festival, and I was driving through the Lake District, and I picked up a hitchhiker, and he'd just been to see Bob Dylan on the Isle of Wight. And that was 1969, as some of you may have witnessed it. Anyone witness it? Oh, hooray. Well, there you go. Anyway, and we were talking away, and he was talking about Bob Dylan, and then, you know, we established he was an electrician, and we talked about that for a bit, and I said I was then a producer, and I was going to Edinburgh, and all that. Anyway, conversation went a bit quiet, as it does in a car, and we were quite happily driving along. And he suddenly said to me, do you mind if I ask you something? Because I'll probably never see you again. And I said, no, that's fine. And he said, do you think I've got a big nose? Now, I mean, when he got in the car, his nose was perfectly ordinary size. Now it's sort of encroaching on my peripheral vision, you see. And I said, no, absolutely not. And I mean, I'll never know what that was about. You know, had a girlfriend kicked him out because his nose, I don't know. But I mean, you know, the reason why I've hung on to that is it's that because I'll probably never see you again. And I mean, I've never used that in writing, but it's things like that that you cling to. And also, I mean, a lot of writing you're projecting, you're trying to think, what would someone say in those circumstances? But you'll hear a line, someone will tell you a line, and you'll think, yeah. And a friend of mine, who's actually in this audience, told me a line. She used to work in a factory, and she said at one stage she was sitting in the canteen, two ladies next to each other. This is some years ago, and they were talking about their husbands. And one said to the other, "Oh, I can always tell when my husband wants a bit, because he leaves his teeth in after supper." I mean, that is a three-act play in one line. And I mean, I could never, I could sit for days and months and years trying to come up with a line like that. I could never do it. But you get, as a writer, I always find if I haven't done something myself, and the more time you spend as a writer behind a keyboard, the less you do other things. So, you've got in a way less to write about. So my way of researching is to take out for lunch somebody who has had the experience, and you get some very interesting input. And when I was writing my feathering mystery called Death Under the Dryer, you'll never guess where that was set. I took out for lunch Margaret, the woman who ran the salon where I had my hair cut, and the lovely Lithuanian diver who cut my hair. And we just had a nice lunch, and I picked their brains about things that, and they told me, just things you never think, because if you spend all your time sitting behind a keyboard, you don't know what it's like having a job and doing ordinary stuff. And people don't really think that's interesting because it's so natural to them. So, I asked them what they did first thing in the morning. Did they sweep up the hair? No, that had been done yesterday. Did they put the music on? Did they check through? Terribly simple stuff. And they told me an interesting thing. They said a lot of people think they're left-handed because they always see them in the mirror. Hadn't occurred to me. I didn't manage to get it in the book, but it's quite interesting because Diver still cuts my hair. And every time I go into her salon, she has a new method of killing someone in her hairdresser. And there was another one I remember who I was writing a Charles Paris book, sort of theatrical background, about a television game show. I think it was called Dead Giveaway, the book. And I'd sort of been a producer. I'd done lots of panel shows in radio and some fairly tacky stuff in television, but I didn't think I knew enough about it. And I suddenly remembered that the secretary of a friend of mine had just started working in BBC television on the Generation Game. This is a long time ago. Bruce Forsyth with his own hair. So, a really long time ago. And I asked her, how did people become contestants on the Generation Game? And this is before email and any of that stuff. So she said, oh, well, normally they write in a letter saying they'd like to be on, and they check through the letters, and the ones that seem kind of vaguely hopeful, they will send them a form to fill in with sort of, details of their age and family and that kind of thing, and a little section for hilarious things that happened on their honeymoon, so that Brucey can have a little snigger about that. And they also, at this point, had to send a Polaroid photograph of themselves. And television then, and possibly still now, is based on the fallacy that everyone is attractive. And she said that in the researcher's office, they had a wall which they called the ugly wall. And on the ugly wall, they stuck the Polaroids of all the people who they thought were physically unsuited to be. And I thought that was so ghastly and so typical of the values of television that it went straight into the book. You can't avoid that kind of thing. I'm going to stop shortly and we'll have some questions, but I think I'll conclude with a true story. People often say if you're a writer, particularly if you're a comedy writer, oh, wonderful thing happened at school, in the office, wherever today, you must put it in one of your scripts. And real life is wonderful and various and all that, but it's very rarely adequate for fiction. And I think writers are there to kind of tidy up fiction so that it's suitable to be read or watched or whatever. This concerns my son, Jack. He of the Jolly Good Show, What? And it was when he was even younger than that. It was when he was about 5 months old. And he was at the stage of his life where my wife and I were carrying him around on one of those sling papoose jobs. When I say we were, obviously either he, she, or I, and he infinitely preferred her front, which I think at the time was proximity to the canteen. Anyway, one Saturday morning, I decided I would take Jack, my son, shopping. I wasn't expecting a lot of input on the shopping front, but an important male bonding exercise. And so we live about 25 miles away, no, 12 miles, 25 minutes away from Chichester, and we're going to shop in Chichester. And so I put Jack in the car seat, and in those days all car seats were in the back facing the front, and I clipped him in. And in that 25-minute drive, Jack, as 5-month-old babies will, fell asleep. And when I got to Chichester, I parked in the theatre car park, and I achieved something only those of you who tried it will know what an achievement it was. I actually got Jack out of his car seat into the sling on my front without waking him up. Thank you very much. Those of you who know the theatre car park in Chichester will know that as well as the traditional, those of you who haven't been into a gentleman's lavatory should have explained. It was nippy and I wanted to take advantage of the facilities, and as well as the traditional seating arrangements, there are kind of ceramic niches neatly shielded from adjacent users. And I was there using mine for the purpose intended, 2 gentlemen either side of me doing the same, when my son Jack woke up. So I'm saying, who's a big boy then? Who's a lovely... At this moment, the 2 gentlemen either side of me exchanged looks and shot out of the gents. Anyway, thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, do we have any questions? What a brilliant talk. Yes.
Who's going first? Me? No, me. That's my wife and I fighting again. In the Fethering Mysteries, you might ask the same question. I sailed over here yesterday with our friends, and you have a yacht club. And in the yacht club, you have magnificent characters, particularly the Commodore. I'd love to name and shame the club you got those characters from. You never know, there might be a club.
Well, actually, my knowledge of sailing, I'm afraid, stopped when I was about 14, when I did learn how to sail. And I didn't really think much of it. I'm afraid I'm a sort of fairly logical person. It seems to make more sense to go straight at something than rather zigzagging. So that's all I knew about sailing. So I'm afraid all those characters completed invention, but I think with any small institution, it attracts certain types. And in fact, we were talking about this earlier, but you know, there are people who are captains of industry or whatever, and they're suddenly cast into the outer reaches of retirement, and they try to command on the same level that they did when they had a major important job. And so I think if you start thinking in that way, you very soon people, you know, you think a yacht club being the Commodore would be really important, and the sort of people who like that sort of thing would like it a lot. But it's complete invention on my part. I've never been a member of a yacht club.
I have met them and they were perfect.
Oh, well,
yeah.
I'm delighted to hear that. Yeah. Well, that's what I said about writers projecting into imagining what it's like in a yacht club. But I don't think I have given talks in yacht clubs, but nothing to do with boats.
Any more questions?
Okay, so my turn. So we like listening to your Fethering Mysteries.
Oh, what, the audios?
The audios, and you actually narrate them. So do you enjoy doing that?
I love it. They let me record my own books for audio, which has happened. I've done most of them now. And it's an amazing experience because, you know, I mean, writing a book, in my case, takes about 3 or 4 months. And then in a day or a day and a half, I sit and read the whole thing in an audio studio. And it's very strange because it compresses. It's a sort of microcosm of those 3 months of my life. And I'll sort of get to the end of a chapter and I think, oh God, that's when the boiler burst. And we had to, you know, because you know, that's when the cat went missing. And it kind of, but I mean, it also has the effect that there are certain characters who don't appear in my books. like people from Northern Ireland, Geordies, Brummies, because I can't do the accents. So given the fact I know I'm going to be reading it, I hold back on that kind of thing. And I was doing one, because I mean, if you sit for a long time in a studio recording a book, the things that worry you most are sort of inadvertent bodily noises, shall I say. And most tummy rumbles are, you know, either just running up to lunch or after lunch. I'm more of a postprandial rumbler myself, I've discovered, and various actors have various methods of dealing with it. Some have a great pile of bananas by them and they just sort of chain eat bananas. Some hold a great big cushion in front of their stomach. But I was doing, there was a book, I think it was called Dead Room Farce, a Charles Paris novel, in which Charles Paris himself was booked to read an audiobook. And so I'm sitting there in an audio studio reading about a fictitious actor recording in an audio studio, and I describe his anxieties and then say, and his stomach went into the third cycle of a dishwasher. And in sympathy, my stomach then went into the third cycle of a dishwasher. I mean, it's spooky, but yes, I do love recording them. Yeah. Do we have another question? Yes, there's a gentleman down here.
Could I say, of a gentleman of a similar age, it's never too late. I think if you wanted a new career as a stand-up, you'd be very successful.
Well, thank you very much. I'll bear that in mind. Thank you.
What I wanted to ask was, you mentioned a lot of different comedians in your
Yeah.
early days, and they're all very different in the way they perform.
Yeah.
And you were just saying about accents. And
Mm-hmm.
did you write bespoke for individual comedians, or was your material something that could be used by 2 or 3 different performers?
That stage of my life, I was producing more than writing, so I wasn't actually writing much for comedians. But in terms of writing for characters, I'd always rather write something, get the characters right without thinking of actors. Because once you start thinking of actors, you get a bit inhibited because you think, oh, she wouldn't like that line, or, you know, she wouldn't do... It's like putting real people in books. You think, no, they wouldn't do that. So I much prefer, when I'm writing scripts, to get the first episode right with the relationship between the characters. And then once they're cast, you know, and they become part of the writing process, because when I was writing After Henry for Prunella Scales and Joan Sanderson, I mean, for instance, Prue could deliver lines faster than almost any actor I've ever encountered. And I found, because one way of controlling, as a writer, controlling what happens to your script if someone else produces it, is to get it to the right length, you know, so that they have to make cuts for performance rather than, you know, rather than cutting chunks of your plot. But the first series of After Henry, almost every script was about 2 minutes short because Prue talked so quickly. So, I mean, things like that, they become part of the writing, but I'd always rather... and writing for comedians, they've all got their own style, as you say. I mean, they know what works for them. And I'm always fascinated by, you know, comedians as a breed. They're very, very interesting characters. I'm a bit stage struck, I think.
One last question. Thank you.
You've written several series. Which is your preferred one? Which do you like best?
It's interesting. I mean, I've written, actually, the book I finished on Tuesday is the first of a new series, which I think at my age is a remarkable form of optimism. It's the, you know, don't eat green bananas, or don't buy green bananas syndrome. I mean, I love Charles Paris because he was the first, and he is probably closest to my own character. The Fethering Ladies I also like very much. I think I almost like Mrs. Pargeter probably the best, and I'm about to start writing another Mrs. Pargeter because she was a character I sort of wrote about 6 books, and I've since... And then I left her for about 15 years, and I've come back. Those books are great fun to write. So yeah, but I like all of them. I mean, I don't have this, some crime writers are desperate to kill off their characters. I'd never do that. I'm far too fond of them. And also with Charles Paris, nobody else gives him any work. So I kind of have to keep writing about him.
Well,
Next.
thank you very much. Let's give Simon a round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you.
really good flavour this afternoon of what you're about, that compassion, that empathy, and that humour as well. So
Yeah,
thank you
absolutely.
so much, Kerry.
Thank you so much, and thank you for coming. Thank you.